The courtroom held its breath. No one moved, no one spoke. In the dead silence, a 14-year-old girl named Elena Carter stood tall in the very center of the room. Her voice trembling but defiant. Her finger pointed at the most powerful man in the chamber, Judge Victor Calloway. "You are the killer," she said, and those words didn't just echo off the wood-paneled walls, they shattered the illusion of order that had kept the system intact for years. Everyone froze. The jury, once stoic and unreadable, blinked in disbelief. The attorneys exchanged confused, almost fearful glances. The stenographer's fingers hovered, suspended over her keys. Even the reporters, used to scandals and shocks, held their breath. All eyes turned toward Elena, a teenager with trembling hands and fire in her eyes, who had just dared to accuse a giant. And that giant, Calloway, sat still, his expression rigid, but something flickered in his eyes. Not confusion, not indignation, something deeper, fear, guilt. Elena's chest rose and fell rapidly as she stepped forward again. "I know what you did," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of truth. The courtroom, just seconds ago filled with rigid control, exploded into chaos. Calloway's assistant rose. Security lunged toward the girl. Lawyers shouted, and the judge's gavel slammed down again and again. But the order was already lost. Elena didn't move, didn't flinch. This wasn't a mistake or a plea for attention. This was war. This was truth, raw and unfiltered, breaking through years of silence. And for Elena, this wasn't about spectacle. It was about her father. 6 months ago, her dad, Detective Ethan Carter, vanished without a trace. No farewell, no warning. One moment, he was the man who tucked her in. And the next, just a photograph collecting dust. The police had said he walked away from the job, from his life, from them, a deserter, a coward. But Elena never believed it. Her father was many things. But he wasn't someone who ran. He was a man who believed in justice, in integrity, in doing what was right even when it was hard. He told her once, "Justice isn't about punishment, Elena. It's about making things right." And when the world turned against him, she held on to those words like a lifeline. She had been alone since then. Her mother had died years ago. And now, it was just her and her little brother, surviving in the shadows of a world that moved on too quickly. And then, one night, the past creaked beneath her, literally. In her father's abandoned study, beneath a loose floorboard, she found it, a folder, yellowed, thin, but heavy with truth, handwritten notes, old newspaper clippings, court records, all pointing to one name, scribbled again and again in red ink, Victor Calloway. That same man who now sat, robed and righteous, behind the bench. Her father had been investigating him, and now her father was gone. It didn't take much to put the pieces together, because some pieces scream when you pick them up. From that moment, Elena knew the truth wasn't buried. It had been hidden, silenced, erased, and if no one else would dig it back up, she would. So here she stood, small against the vast architecture of power, holding nothing but courage and memory. She looked at Calloway, her eyes blazing. "You took everything from me," her voice seemed to say even when her lips didn't move. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time in his long, untouchable career, Judge Calloway felt something unfamiliar, powerless. The moments stretched. The world outside the courtroom faded. Inside, it was just the truth, demanding to be heard. Elena Carter didn't need to be believed in that moment. She only needed to be seen. And she was. Every camera turned to her. Every journalist scribbled her name. Every whisper echoed what everyone was too afraid to say aloud until now. What if she's telling the truth? What if the man behind the bench is no better than the criminals he condemns? The story that began with a disappearance had just become something far more dangerous, a reckoning. And Elena, with all her youth and pain and fury, was not just searching for her father anymore. She was coming for justice. And justice was listening. The house was too quiet. The kind of silence that pressed against your skin like cold mist. Elena stood in the doorway of her father's study, a place she hadn't dared enter in weeks. The scent of his aftershave still lingered in the air, sharp, clean, familiar, ghostly now. Everything in the room was untouched. Except her. The police had combed through this space already, taking what they thought was important, labeling the rest as irrelevant. But they didn't know him like she did. Her father wasn't sloppy, and if he had found something dangerous, something that could get him killed, he wouldn't have left it out in the open. Her eyes scanned the wooden floor until she saw it, a faint crack between two planks. Her heart thudded in her chest as she dropped to her knees and pressed her palm against the worn boards. One of them lifted slightly. With fingers trembling, she pried it up, and there it was. A thin, battered folder. Her breath caught as she opened it. Inside, handwritten notes in her father's sharp scrawl, newspaper clippings, sealed court documents, fragments of something dark, something too big for one man to carry alone. And over, one name, circled in thick, angry red ink, Judge Victor Calloway. Her blood ran cold. Her father hadn't walked away. He had been silenced. She knew it now with a certainty that settled in her bones like steel. This wasn't a missing persons case. This was murder. She didn't have time to process it. A sound, soft, deliberate, echoed from the hallway. A floorboard creaked. Her breath caught. The house was supposed to be empty. Her little brother was sleeping at a friend's. She was alone, or she was supposed to be. Slowly, heart hammering, she rose to her feet and stepped into the hallway. The darkness felt heavier now. Every shadow seemed to move. She made her way up the stairs, one hand sliding along the wall, fingers brushing against the familiar, grounding texture of old wallpaper. The house was still, but her bedroom door was open. She had closed it, she was sure. A chill crawled down her spine. She stepped inside, scanning the room. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, but something had changed. A note, a single sheet of paper taped to her mirror. Black ink on white, just two words: stop digging. Her breath hitched, her fingers curled into trembling fists. But that wasn't the worst part. The closet door was ajar, just an inch. But it had been closed. She remembered closing it that morning, like she always did, and now it was open. Someone had been in her room. Someone had stood where she stood, touched her things, watched her, and left a message. They didn't take anything because they weren't after things. They wanted her to feel it, the fear, the threat, the warning. She stood frozen, trying to quiet her breathing, her pulse roaring in her ears. The note was still fluttering slightly, as if the air hadn't yet settled, as if they'd only just left. She should have been terrified, and she was. But beneath the fear, something else ignited: anger, a fire that pushed past the terror and turned it into resolve. They were watching her. They had eyes on her life, her house, her every move, but she wouldn't stop. She couldn't, because this wasn't just about her father anymore. Whoever had done this, whoever had taken him, was still out there. Still pulling strings, still controlling the narrative, and they were trying to silence her, the same way they silenced him. But Elena Carter had already lost too much. Her childhood, her mother, her sense of safety. She wasn't going to lose the truth. She wasn't going to be their next erasure. Her fingers tightened around the folder. It was dangerous. She knew that now more than ever. But danger didn't scare her. Being forgotten did. And if they wanted her silent, they would have to try harder. Because now she wasn't just her father's daughter. She was his legacy, and legacies don't fade quietly. She stared into the mirror, the note still clinging there like a challenge. Her reflection pale but unbroken. She tore it down, crumpled it in her hand, and whispered to the empty room, "You should have done better than a note." Then she turned, folder pressed to her chest, and walked out of the room, not like a scared little girl, but like someone stepping into the storm on purpose. The rain poured in relentless sheets as Elena Carter pulled her hood tighter, her soaked sneakers slapping against the glistening pavement with every step toward the neon-lit diner that flickered like a dying heartbeat at the edge of town. Her fingers were numb, not just from the cold, but from the weight of the folder clutched inside her jacket, the weight of everything she had uncovered. Everything that had been taken from her. The smell of stale grease and burnt coffee hit her as she pushed through the diner door. the warmth inside doing nothing to thaw the ice in her chest. She didn't notice the clink of forks or the murmur of tired conversations. Her eyes locked immediately on the man in the corner booth, Daniel Reeves. He looked like the ghost of someone who used to matter. A former FBI agent reduced to a shadow under a worn leather jacket and weeks of unshaven regret. His broad shoulders were hunched, his fingers mindlessly stirring coffee that had long gone cold. Elena approached slowly, her heart pounding like a warning drum. But he didn't look up. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, his voice rough, like gravel soaked in sorrow. But she slid into the booth across from him anyway. Her jaw set. "You knew my father," she said, and this time, his eyes lifted. They were tired, sunken, but still sharp enough to cut through lies. "I did." The admission was quiet, reluctant, like something that had been buried and now clawed its way to the surface. "Then you know he didn't just disappear." Elena's voice cracked, but she held it steady. "I found his files. He was investigating Judge Calloway." Reeves leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. A gesture of disbelief or maybe defeat. "And now you are too," he said, more statement than question. She nodded. "I need your help." He let out a bitter chuckle and shook his head. "Kid, you have no idea what you've stepped into." But she didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm stepping into." For a moment, he just stared at her. And then, slowly, something changed in his expression. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even concern. It was recognition, like in that one moment. He saw Ethan Carter again, not the man himself, but the fire that had once burned in his eyes, now burning in hers. "All right, kid," Reeves finally said, pushing aside his coffee. "Tell me everything." And she did. Every page she'd read. Every connection she'd made. The night someone broke into her house. The note on the mirror. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, just listened. The silence between them thick with memory and truth. When she finished, he sat quietly for a long time before speaking. "Calloway's bad," he said slowly, "but he's not the worst of them." Elena blinked. "What do you mean?" Reeves reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn, crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it and slid it across the table. A name was written in bold black ink, Alexander Blackwood. Just reading it sent a chill down Elena's spine. "Who is he?" she whispered. Reeves leaned back, jaw tightening. "He's not a politician, not a judge. He's worse. He's the kind of man who operates in the shadows. The people in power, they answer to him." Elena's hands curled into fists. "My father was investigating him." Reeves nodded. "That's why he's gone." The words hit like a punch to the ribs, knocking the wind from her lungs. Up until now, she had believed Calloway was the enemy. But now, a darker truth was surfacing. Her father had stumbled into something so much bigger and far more dangerous. Blackwood wasn't just behind the curtain, he was the curtain. The architect of the lies. The one who made people like Calloway possible. And if her father had found that out, it meant only one thing. He had been silenced not just to protect a corrupt judge, but to protect an entire empire. Elena sat there, staring at the name on the page as if it were cursed. But something in her solidified. She wasn't afraid, not anymore, because now she knew what she was up against. Now she knew where to aim. Hope was a fragile thing, and Elena had learned not to trust it, not after losing her father. Not after sleepless nights spent searching shadows for answers that never came, but for the first time in what felt like forever. She allowed herself to believe. Linda Grayson had promised her everything. Not rumors, not speculation, but evidence, real, damning, undeniable proof that Judge Calloway wasn't untouchable, that her father hadn't vanished by choice, that the rot Elena had sensed beneath the surface of the justice system was as real and dangerous as she feared. "Meet me tomorrow, downtown, 3 p.m., Linda had whispered over the phone the night before, her voice tight with urgency and something else, fear. Elena had clutched that promise like a lifeline, barely sleeping, her mind racing with possibilities. What if this was it? What if she was just hours away from breaking the silence that had swallowed her father whole? What if someone finally believed her? The next afternoon, she arrived early, The coffee shop was tucked between forgotten storefronts in a quiet part of the city. The kind of place where people went to be invisible. She chose a table by the window, fingers tightening around the edge of the wood, her leg bouncing under the table. She waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10, 30, a full hour. Her coffee went cold, her throat tightened, but Linda never came. The feeling started as a pit in her stomach and grew into something monstrous, a weight pressing on her chest, whispering that something was wrong, terribly wrong. She tried calling, no answer. She walked outside, scanned every face on the sidewalk, hoping to spot her. Nothing. The rest of the day passed in a haze of confusion and unease. Until the truth came crashing in that evening through the cold, clinical voice of the news anchor on television. Local journalist Linda Grayson was killed this afternoon in a tragic hit-and-run accident. No suspects have been identified. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Elena sat frozen, her breath caught halfway in her chest, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. It was too clean, too perfect, too scripted. The anchor's words sounded rehearsed, as if someone had handed him the lines long before the story even broke. Linda hadn't died, she had been silenced. Just like her father, Reeves was the one who turned off the TV. But Elena barely noticed. It wasn't until the screen went dark that she saw her own reflection staring back, pale, hollow-eyed, fists shaking. "Kid," Reeves said softly, his voice edged with something dangerously close to fear. "You need to stop." But stop, as if she could, as if it hadn't already been real the moment someone left a note on her mirror. As if Linda's death didn't just confirm everything she'd been chasing. They were watching, and now they weren't just warning her, they were eliminating threats. Elena felt something inside her crack wide open, not with fear, but with fury. She could run, she could disappear, she could play it safe and hope to live another day. But she knew that if she did, it would all have been for nothing. Her father would stay missing. Linda's death would vanish into another headline buried beneath politics and weather. The truth would rot in silence. And so would she. She looked at Reeves, who stared at her like a man staring into the past, into everything he once fought for and lost. Her voice was low but steady when she said, "I'm not stopping." He didn't argue, couldn't, because he saw it now. She wasn't a scared kid chasing ghosts anymore. She was fire, and fire doesn't run. It burns until there's nothing left to consume. The courtroom was electric, charged with the kind of tension that made the very air feel heavier, harder to breathe, as if the truth itself had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. Cameras clicked in rapid-fire bursts, capturing every twitch, every glance, every fragment of history about to be rewritten. Outside, the crowd surged behind barricades, a sea of restless bodies shouting for justice, their voices bleeding through the courthouse walls. Inside, Elena Carter stood still, quiet but unyielding, watching from the back as Judge Victor Calloway, the man who once symbolized law and order, sat behind the defendant's table. His face as hard and polished as ever, but this time, framed by fear. Her hands were clenched at her sides, fingernails biting into her palms, breath slow and steady, because this was it, the moment she'd bled for, run for, nearly died for. The evidence had been gathered, the lies unraveled, and her father's silent crusade brought into the light. FBI agents moved with precision, dark suits against gleaming wood, one stepping forward and pulling out a pair of cold, gleaming handcuffs. "Judge Victor Calloway," the agent's voice rang out. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding in organized crime." The gasp that followed wasn't just shock. It was collective disbelief cracking open into something raw and awakening. The jury froze. Lawyers gaped. Reporters forgot to type. Elena's lungs finally expanded, her body loosening under the weight of months spent clawing through shadows for answers. It was over. She had won. Or so she thought. Because then, something shifted, as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Calloway didn't beg, didn't lash out. He smiled, not a defeated smile, not a desperate one, but something deeper, colder, like a man who knew the rules of the game better than anyone else and was already 10 steps ahead. Slowly, he turned to her, locking eyes like a predator recognizing a worthy opponent. "You think this is over?" he said, voice calm, almost amused. Elena straightened, unwilling to waver. "I think you're finished," she answered, firm, but he only chuckled, the sound low, knowing, "They always come for the pawns first," he murmured, and the words slithered into the room like smoke. Her jaw tightened. "Pawns?" she repeated, but she already understood. He wasn't the king, just another piece on the board. "The man who moves the pieces," he said, voice smooth even as the cuffs bit into his wrists. "He's still out there." And suddenly, the victory that had glowed so brightly in her chest began to dim, flicker, and collapse under the weight of a darker, colder truth. Alexander Blackwood. The name rose in her mind like a ghost, whispered once in a diner booth and scribbled across her father's notes in frantic, determined ink. Calloway had been the shield, but Blackwood had been the sword. Elena's body went cold. This wasn't the end. This was the first layer peeled away, revealing a deeper rot. The headlines were already exploding. Calloway arrested. Justice served. But none of them saw what Elena saw in that moment, a man smiling as his empire fell. Not because he thought he would escape, but because he knew someone far worse was still in power, and that someone was untouchable. For now, she stepped back from the courtroom doors, the noise behind her swelling into a frenzy, shutters clicking, voices rising, history unfolding, but all she could hear was the echo of Calloway's final warning. The game wasn't over, it had only just begun. Victory should have felt like peace, but instead, it felt like a ticking clock, each second louder than the last. Each moment waited with the sense that the storm wasn't over, it was just circling back. Only hours had passed since Judge Calloway had been led out in handcuffs. Headlines lighting up screens with words like "justice" and "fall of power." But Elena Carter knew better. She and Reeves had slipped away quietly from the courthouse. No smiles, no celebration, just quiet footsteps and heavy eyes. Because they knew Calloway was never the end. And when night fell, it came not with silence, but with pursuit. They took back roads, twisting through alleys and shadowed streets. Reeves driving like a man who had lived too many lives. Switching cars twice, avoiding traffic cameras, his instincts razor sharp. But it wasn't enough. It never is when your enemies are made of shadows and secrets. The first warning came as headlights, two black SUVs appearing in the rearview mirror like vultures drawn to fresh blood. Reeves muttered a curse, his knuckles whitening on the wheel. "We've got company," tires screamed as he veered hard down a narrow alley, the car scraping brick, the night swallowing them whole. But the SUVs followed, relentless and silent, moving with the precision of trained hunters. Then impact, metal against metal, a brutal jolt from behind sent their car spinning, shrieking across the pavement before crashing hard against a concrete barrier. For a moment, everything went black. Elena's vision swam as she blinked through the ringing in her ears. Smoke curling from the hood, the acrid stench of burning rubber choking the air. Reeves groaned beside her, bleeding, barely conscious, but alert enough to mutter, "They're not here to talk." Outside, doors slammed, and boots hit pavement. No yelling, no chaos, just efficiency. Silence wrapped in danger. Elena's breath came in ragged pulls, adrenaline flooding her limbs as she dragged herself out of the wreckage, half carrying Reeves as they stumbled into the night, slipping between rusted fences and broken alleyways. The sound of their pursuers never far behind. These weren't random thugs, they were soldiers, and they were coming for her. Not for intimidation, not for messages, but for elimination. Reeves was losing blood fast. But he didn't stop moving, didn't complain. He knew this game, knew the rules. "Go," he hissed between shallow breaths. "If they catch you, I'm not leaving you," she snapped, dragging him into the dark shell of an abandoned warehouse on the city's edge. The cold concrete biting through her knees as they collapsed behind a stack of rusted crates. His strength was fading, But his eyes still burned with that same fire she had once seen in her father's gaze, the will to fight. Even when it was hopeless. "Hospitals won't help us now," he said, barely above a whisper, and she knew he was right. If Blackwood had found him this quickly, nowhere was safe. Not the streets, not the courts, not even the truth. "You need to run," he told her again, a plea wrapped in a command. But she couldn't, wouldn't. "They killed my father," she whispered. "They killed Linda, and now they're hunting us down like we're nothing." Her fists shook. "If I run, then they win." Reeves didn't argue, just stared at her, a flicker of pride behind the pain. She wasn't the scared girl from the courtroom anymore. She was something else now. Someone else. The cold settled deeper in her bones. But the fire in her chest refused to die. She helped him sit upright. Blood staining his shirt. His breathing shallow but present. Outside, footsteps echoed. The shadows moved. And Elena knew. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about defiance. About not going quiet. About lighting the match and letting it all burn. She wasn't just running from something. She was running toward it. Toward the truth. Toward Blackwood. Toward whatever came next, even if it killed her. The warehouse was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that pressed against your skin and whispered of traps. Of eyes watching from behind the dark. Elena crouched low behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. Her heart pounding like a war drum inside her chest. Each beat reminding her that this was real. That this was the edge where everything could end. The overhead lights flickered in tired pulses, casting warped shadows across the concrete. The kind that made everything look distorted, uncertain, dangerous. Somewhere ahead, just beyond the blur of steel and silence, voices murmured, controlled, calm, the voices of men who had never known fear because they had never needed to. Blackwood was here. The name alone sent a chill down her spine. Not because it sounded monstrous, but because it didn't, because it belonged to the kind of man who hid in plain sight. Who wore expensive suits and made quiet phone calls that changed the world. For days she and Reeves had tracked this moment, gathering every broken piece of evidence, each paper trail and whispered lead, stringing them together like fragile thread that had finally led them here, to the heart of it. Reeves moved ahead of her, a wounded ghost slipping through shadows, his steps careful despite the pain etched into his every breath. Even now, injured, barely able to stand, he moved like someone with purpose, with memory, like a soldier who refused to forget the war wasn't over. Elena mirrored him, her own fear buried beneath grit and fury. She had been reckless before, ruled by emotion, by grief. But not tonight. Tonight she was steel, focused. Her fingers curled around the small recorder in her pocket. Their secret weapon, one confession, one slip from Blackwood's mouth. And the world would finally hear the truth. But then a voice sliced through the silence. Smooth and unhurried, as if the speaker had all the time in the world. "You can come out now." Miss Carter. Her blood turned to ice. Blackwood knew. He'd known. All along. Reeves froze mid-step, the tension snapping through the space like a wire pulled too tight. Elena barely dared to breathe as she peeked between the containers. There he stood, Alexander Blackwood, in a tailored dark suit that caught the flickering light like oil. His posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. Power didn't just follow him. It clung to him like smoke. Behind him stood a wall of men in black suits. Unmoving, unreadable, like statues carved from silence. This wasn't a confrontation, it was an ambush. A rustle to her left made her spin. Too late. Two men emerged from the darkness, grabbing Reeves. He fought, landing a punch, but he was weak, already bleeding. One blow sent him staggering to his knees, blood running from a fresh cut on his temple. Elena's breath caught. No, 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 this wasn't the plan. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Reeves met her gaze, his eyes fierce despite the pain. And in them was one message: don't do anything stupid. But she was already moving, already standing. She couldn't let them kill him. Blackwood approached with slow, measured steps, his hands behind his back, his voice smooth like velvet soaked in poison. "You've caused quite the mess." he said, smiling faintly. Let him go, Elena demanded, her voice sharp but shaking. Blackwood tilted his head, amused. Now, that's not how this works. With a simple gesture, one of his men pressed a gun to Reeves's head. Elena's stomach twisted, her hands trembled, but she didn't back down. You remind me of your father, Blackwood mused. Always digging, always believing truth matters. His eyes turned cold, and look where that got him. Fury roared inside her, but she kept it buried beneath her skin. You're going to give me everything, he continued. Every file, every recording, every name. Another nod toward Reeves. Or, you know how this ends. She didn't move, didn't answer. Time was running out. 5 seconds, he said calmly. 5. Her fingers slipped into her pocket. 4. The recorder was still there. Still on. 3. Reeves was watching her, his eyes begging her not to give in. 2. Her heart thundered, her breath caught. She had to move, now. Elena's heart pounded like a war drum, each second stretching out like a lifetime as Blackwood's countdown echoed in her ears. 5. 4. 3. Her fingers curled around the small recorder in her pocket. But she didn't reach for it. Not yet, because hidden inside her coat, tucked just beneath the edge of her sleeve, was something more powerful than anything Blackwood could have anticipated. Her phone. Camera already rolling, broadcasting every word, every threat, every calculated smile to the world beyond these 4 walls. He thought she was cornered, thought he was in control. That fear would crush her the way it had crushed so many before, but he didn't know her. Didn't know the fire she carried or the lines she had already crossed. As he reached, too, Elena raised her hand slowly, deliberately, her breath trembling, her posture slouched just enough to sell the illusion of defeat. Blackwood smirked, a predator savoring the moment of submission. That's a good girl, he said, voice dripping with mock affection, as if he'd already won. But before he could take another step, a low sound rumbled through the stillness, a hum. Distant at first, but rising. Sirens. Not one, but many. Outside the warehouse, red and blue lights began to dance against the broken windows, flickering across the shadows like fire. Blackwood's expression faltered, just for a second, the first fracture in his polished calm. His men shifted, tense, uncertain. Elena took a breath, slow and deliberate, and pulled out her phone. The screen glowed, alive with thousands of comments flooding in faster than she could read. The livestream's view count ticking upward like a heartbeat on fire. You should really check your phone, she said, her voice quiet but sharp as glass. Blackwood blinked, the weight of realization settling in his eyes like storm clouds forming at sea. You've been live this whole time, she continued, her voice steady now, rising with purpose. The whole world heard you. They saw your face. They heard what you threatened to do. For the first time, he hesitated, and in that hesitation, his empire began to crumble. Before he could move, the warehouse doors exploded open, FBI agents pouring in like a tidal wave. Guns raised, voices thundering, "Drop your weapons." His men panicked, some raised their hands in surrender, others dropped their weapons to the ground with heavy thuds. Eyes wide with disbelief, Reeves, still on his knees, gave a pained, breathless laugh and spat blood to the side. "Told you," he rasped. "She's smarter than you." Elena barely heard him. The adrenaline had flooded her senses. The moment stretching as the agents swarmed, shouting commands, forcing Blackwood to the ground. She watched as his knees hit the concrete, his wrists pulled behind his back, the cold snap of metal cuffs cutting through the noise like a bell. Still, even as they pinned him down, he didn't scream, didn't plead. He turned his head, his eyes finding hers one last time. And then, he smiled. Not in rage, not in defeat, but with something worse, patience. Calculation, like a man who still believed this wasn't the end. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Because in his eyes, she didn't see fear, she saw a promise. A warning, a vow that this wasn't over. But she didn't look away. Not this time. She stared him down as the agents dragged him toward the light. Toward justice. toward the waiting cameras that had already begun their frenzy. And though her body was shaking, half from exhaustion, half from release, she stood tall. She had done it, against every threat, every warning, every shadow cast over her life. She had won, not just for herself, but for her father, for Linda, for every name written in red ink in her father's file. She had torn open the darkness and let the truth bleed out for the world to see. And still, she knew, this wasn't the last chapter. Because the system that protected men like Blackwood didn't vanish with one arrest. Corruption didn't disappear overnight. But now, the veil had been lifted. Now, the world was watching, and Elena Carter, once just a grieving daughter, was now something else entirely. A symbol, a reckoning, a spark in a house soaked in gasoline. And she wasn't done burning yet. The world erupted the moment Alexander Blackwood was led out of the courthouse in chains. His tailored suit rumpled, his wrists bound in steel, cameras flashing like lightning strikes as reporters shouted over one another, their voices fighting to capture the moment history shifted, but Elena Carter didn't move. Didn't cheer, didn't cry, because she wasn't fooled by the spectacle. She watched from a distance, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her breath steady, her heart heavy, because while the world saw justice, she saw a man who wasn't broken, wasn't defeated. He walked like a king in exile, not a criminal brought low. And when his eyes met hers through the chaos, he smiled, not smug, not bitter, but calculating, like a man who knew the walls were closing in and had already begun building new doors. She had exposed him, brought his empire to its knees. But still, there was no body, no grave, no answer. Her father was still missing. And Blackwood's smile reminded her that justice was a war, not a moment. The headlines called her a hero. The internet lit up with theories, praise, outrage. Blackwood's allies, judges, CEOs, politicians, began to surface like wreckage from a sunken ship, each one scrambling to escape the current she had unleashed. But even as the world celebrated, Elena felt the emptiness pressing at the edges of her soul. She had torn the mask from the monster, but it hadn't brought her father back. There was no knock at the door, no embrace, no whispered, "You did good, kid," just silence, just the haunting weight of a victory that still left too many questions buried. Weeks passed, the world moved on, as it always does. The media chased new disasters, new villains, but Elena couldn't move forward, not when every step away from the truth felt like betrayal. She spent her nights staring at the folder, at the notes in her father's handwriting, memorizing the curves and loops of his letters as if they were lifelines. Proof he had existed. Her apartment grew quiet again, too quiet, until one night, as rain tapped lightly against her windows and the city pulsed outside like a restless animal. Something slid under her door, a plain envelope, no name, no return address, no markings. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear so potent it nearly brought her to her knees. She tore it open, breath catching, and inside, no documents, no threats, no photos, just a single piece of paper, 2 words, handwritten in familiar ink, "Keep going." Her knees buckled as she sank to the floor. The note clutched to her chest. Her breath hitched and shallow. Because she knew this handwriting. She knew it from birthday cards, from scribbled notes left on the fridge, from margins of case files where he used to underline the truth. It was his. It was her father's. He was alive, somehow, somewhere, and in that instant, the weight that had been crushing her chest for months lifted just enough for her to breathe again. Tears spilled down her cheeks. But they weren't from grief. They were from fire, from something reignited inside her that she hadn't dared to feel since the day he vanished, hope. She rose slowly, the letter pressed to her heart, and stepped outside into the cold night, the wind biting against her skin like a promise, the city glowing around her in fractured reflections. Above her, the sky stretched wide and endless, stars blinking like distant signals across the dark. And she knew, deep in her bones, that this wasn't the end, not even close. Blackwood's empire had fallen, but the roots of his power still snaked through the city, still clung to walls and names and secrets. The system that let him rise was still standing. And her father was out there. Maybe hiding, maybe hunted, but alive. And if he thought she would stop now, if anyone thought she would stop now, they didn't understand who she had become. She wasn't just chasing justice anymore. She was chasing blood, chasing light, chasing her father through the dark. She looked to the stars one last time, whispered his name like a promise, and turned toward the unknown. Her breath steady, her feet moving forward, because the truth was still out there, and she wasn't done. The night air wrapped around Elena like a cloak, cold, sharp, and bracing, but she didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She stood still beneath the vast sky, the stars glittering like distant truths waiting to be found, the weight of the letter still warm against her chest, as if his handwriting could pass through the paper and into her skin. Keep going, 2 words, but they said everything. They shattered the silence that had haunted her since the day he disappeared. They breathed life into the parts of her that had gone numb from grief, from doubt, from months of fighting battles that felt impossible to win. And now she knew, he was alive. Not gone, not a ghost, out there, somewhere, still breathing, still fighting in his own way. And that changed everything. The war hadn't ended with Blackwood in cuffs. That had only been a page in the story, not the final chapter, because the system that built Blackwood, that allowed men like Calloway to thrive, that buried truth beneath politics and power, was still alive and well, wounded but not dead. Elena had cracked its armor, exposed its heart, but it was still beating, and it was angry. She could feel it, like a storm gathering at the edge of the horizon, waiting for her to stop, to rest, to let her guard down. But she wouldn't, she couldn't, because now the fight wasn't just about what had been taken. It was about what still remained. Her father had survived, somehow, and if he believed in her enough to send that letter, then she would burn down the world to find him. Every late night spent poring over his files, every whispered name, every hidden connection, it had all led her here, to this moment, where she stood not as a victim, not as a girl chasing ghosts, but as something else entirely, a force, a reckoning. She thought of Linda Grayson, of the strength it had taken for a woman to whisper the truth into a phone line, knowing it could cost her everything, and it had. She thought of Reeves, bloodied and broken, still choosing to stand beside her when he could have run. She thought of her little brother, asleep in a world that would never be simple again, and she thought of the message, the scrawled ink in her father's familiar hand, and how it reminded her that love, like truth, had a way of surviving even the darkest things. She moved through the streets like a shadow, past the flickering street lamps, past faces buried in their phones and lives, unaware of the war being waged just beneath the surface. To them, Blackwood was yesterday's headline. Justice had been served, but they didn't see what she saw. They didn't feel the rot still festering beneath polished institutions and well-practiced lies. They didn't see the smirk he gave her as the cuffs closed around his wrists, the promise that he wasn't done. Elena did, and she would never forget it. She reached her apartment, locked the door behind her, and sat down at her desk, spreading the contents of the folder again, the notes, the maps, the names, this time not to solve a mystery, but to build a strategy. This wasn't a puzzle anymore. This was war. Every red string on the wall, every marked photo, every headline, was a target, and she would hit them all. She knew the road ahead would be harder now. More eyes were watching, more enemies were waiting, but she wasn't afraid. She welcomed it, because they had underestimated her for too long, treated her like a child, treated her grief like a weakness, treated her father like a threat that could be erased. And they were wrong, all of them. She looked down at the letter one more time, running her fingers over the ink, letting the memory of his voice wrap around the words. Keep going, she would, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, because she knew now that survival wasn't enough. Justice wasn't enough, not when the people who controlled the system thought they could rebuild it in the same shadows. She wasn't just going to tear down what Blackwood had built. She was going to expose everything, every lie, every name, every secret, until the truth wasn't just known. It was undeniable, until the whole damn world had no choice but to listen. Elena stood alone at the edge of a city that had no idea how close it had come to losing itself. The streetlights casting long shadows at her feet like ghosts trying to hold her back. But she didn't stop, didn't hesitate, because everything she had fought for, everything she had lost and found again, had brought her to this exact moment, this pause between endings and beginnings. Between falling empires and rising truths. Blackwood was gone, locked away, his name scorched into headlines. His power shattered like glass beneath the weight of justice. But even as the cameras turned away and the world began to breathe again, Elena knew better, because men like him don't vanish. They hibernate, they retreat, and they wait for the world to forget, to soften, to turn its gaze elsewhere. But she wouldn't forget, she couldn't, not when the system that created him still pulsed behind polished marble walls and expensive suits. Not when the rot had only begun to bleed into the light. She had dragged the truth out by its throat and made the world look at it. Forced him to see what it cost to silence a man like her father. To bury a name like Linda Grayson. To nearly erase her. And now, there was no going back. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Heavy with files, notes, names, unfinished stories waiting for her hands to write the next chapter. She wasn't chasing shadows anymore. She was hunting legacies. What had started with grief had turned into something sharper, harder, more dangerous, purpose. She could still feel the weight of that letter in her pocket. The ink her father had laid down like a lifeline, keep going. And she would, for him, for the girl who had cried herself to sleep every night hoping for a knock at the door. For the woman she was becoming, forged in silence and sharpened by fire. For the people still trapped in the machinery of a system that treated truth like a threat. She inhaled deeply, the cold air cutting through her lungs like glass but grounding her. Somewhere, her father was alive. Somewhere, he was watching, maybe even closer than she thought. Maybe just out of reach. Helping in the only ways he could. She didn't need confirmation anymore. The note had said enough. His voice was in her now. Not in whispers but in war cries. She remembered how he used to say, "Justice isn't clean, Elena. It's not kind, but it matters." And now she finally understood. The price of truth wasn't just danger, it was loneliness. It was walking paths no one else dared to follow. But it was worth it. Because change never came from comfort. And revolutions didn't begin with permission. They began with fire, with fury, with a girl who wouldn't sit down when the world told her to be quiet. The stars were faint overhead. But they were still there, scattered like promises across the dark. And as she looked up at them, she felt that quiet ache again, not pain, not fear, but determination, the kind that doesn't scream but simmers, the kind that endures. Elena didn't know what the next step looked like. She only knew she'd take it, whether that meant finding new allies, following new trails, or exposing the next monster hiding behind a smile. She would be ready, because the truth didn't end with Blackwood. It only began there, and she would carry it forward, even if it broke her, even if it cost her everything. She turned away from the street, from the safety of quiet corners and whispered survival, and began to walk, not fast, not frantic, but with purpose, with weight, with the full force of everything she had learned and everything she was willing to become. The city hummed around her, alive with its secrets, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like it was listening, like the ground beneath her steps recognized the shift. Elena Carter wasn't the girl who begged to be heard anymore. She was the voice, the storm, the blade in the dark. And this was only the beginning.